So I was listening to Bill George last night on a LinkedIn Learning episode that he just released, and it was talking about leadership in a crisis. And he made this point. He said, I would say, pull in the best experts you can find to help you through a crisis. Don't try to be that expert yourself. If you have a financial challenge, bring in a financial expert. That may be someone from your team, it may be someone from the outside. And the most important thing for you to do is to admit to yourself that what you don't know. So you can get the best people and be the leader who integrates it all and has to make the really hard decisions using judgment, intuition, data-driven insights, and the input of true experts. So I'm on a personal mission over the last couple of weeks to connect my extended network, our entire ecosystem, to the greatest thinkers, the people who are most qualified to help us emerge stronger from crisis and thrive in the next normal. I'm talking about gaining perspective from people who in their domain would find themselves on Mount Rushmore. Amongst all the noise that surrounds us today, we've got to find the signal we need to make great decisions, to find ways to build more resilient collaborative ecosystems, and to be more adaptive than we've ever allowed ourselves or our organizations to be. And to achieve that, deep domain expertise is critically important to reduce business risk and accelerate progress towards positive outcomes again. We're in the midst of a great inflection point, the fastest and most aggressive we've seen in our lifetimes. And when it comes to recognizing and anticipating inflection points, there's really only one resource who rises to the top in that conversation. Her name is Rita McGrath. Rita is a best-selling author, a longtime professor at Columbia Business School in New York City. She's widely recognized as the premier expert on leading innovation and growth during times of uncertainty. She's received the #1 Achievement Award for Strategy from the prestigious Thinkers 50 and has been consistently named one of the world's top 10 management thinkers. As a consultant to CEOs, her work has had a lasting impact on Fortune 500 companies and organizations of all sizes and types around the world. She's an author of the best-selling The End of Competitive Advantage in 2013. Her 2019 book, just recently released, Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. She's written 3 other books, including Discovery-Driven Growth, which Clayton Christensen cited as creating one of the most important management ideas ever developed. She's a highly back-to-back during times like this, sought-after speaker. And Rita, I was humbled by your quick and easy acceptance of the invitation that I made a couple of weeks ago. And so I just want to start by saying thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And you're doing great work. I really think it's just vital to keep communities connected at this point.
Thank you. Over the next 35 minutes or so, I thought we could just have a conversation around some of the more well-known and widely used frameworks that you developed, ones that leaders and organizations can leverage during times like this. During the introduction, I used the term inflection point a couple of times, and it's in the subtitle of Seeing Around Corners. Could you help us just level set on a working definition for the term inflection points, and then give us an example or two in the context of the crisis?
So an inflection point is really something that causes a 10x change in some constraint or metric that has informed your business decision making for a long time. So let me give a specific example. So Columbia Business School has a very straightforward business model, right? We take in roughly 650, 700 students every year. We hang on to them for 2 years. We release them into the world. They pay tuition. We all understand what that's like. And so 6 months ago, if you had said to me, well, what's predictable about the class of 2020? I would have told you, well, it's going to be an awful lot like the class of 2019. And the class of 2021 is going to be an awful lot like the class of 2020, because it was a very predictable model. And we knew what all the metrics were, and we knew what the ratings were that we needed to have. And we knew who was going to hire our students. We knew where they were going to have internships. With COVID-19, that's all up in the air right now. We don't even know if we're going to be permitted to have students on campus. If we do have them on campus, we don't know what accommodations are going to have to be made, making the assumption that we don't have a vaccine or a cure by next September. So there's tremendous uncertainty. And I have to credit the administration. They're really working very hard, best minds again, try to really think through what this looks like. But will students pay tuition for a remote experience when they can't go to the Follies and they're not having the after, the happy hour? What will that economic model look like? We don't know. So all of our our assumptions about the way the world works really get sort of tossed up in the air. And we've got whole sectors of the economy based on the assumption that people are not uncomfortable being in places with strangers. Travel, entertainment, restaurants, sports, the list goes on. And so all of those assumptions that have been built up over a long period of time are really going to be challenged.
Specific to higher education, you've written a lot over the years about the need for, you and Clayton Christensen both, about the need for higher ed to disrupt itself. We've certainly seen a tremendous amount of change occur very quickly in higher ed to offer digital learning environments and so forth. Mm-hmm. As we move towards the fall semester, what changes do you see perpetuating? What other changes do you see coming as a function of what we are going through right now?
Sure. So a couple of issues that I have with higher ed is the first issue is we've really observed rampant degree inflation over the last 10, 15 years. As having a college degree became an easy way for hiring managers to sort through the mountains of applications they have to process. Well, impose a 4-year college degree requirement, and guess what? Your pile goes from here to here. So it gets much easier. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't really represent what a person can do. So we've got credentialing that happens at a level other than the level of the skill or the capability. So the problem with that is you're now as a person, you're taking out student loans, you're paying for that 4-year degree experience, you're buying something in effect that really doesn't have anything to do with what you're going to do with it after you've gone through. So far more students start the 4-year degree process than can complete it. So I think that's the first problem. And if we can start to see credentialing at the level of the skill, so I can actually test what you know, and I can give you a banner or a badge or something that says, yes, this person writes great code and they've been upvoted on GitHub or something, that whole degree stranglehold goes away. And I think what you're going to see is the unbundling. So similar to when you could buy an individual song rather than have to buy the whole album. Once you can get an individual credential without having to buy the whole package of 4-year experiences, you have unbundling. So that leads me to a second point, which is the power of the university to exert requirements might decline considerably. So Clayton said this a long time ago. He said, what's going to matter is not did you graduate from Ohio State. What's going to matter is did you get a certified badge for innovation proficiency from the Clayton Christensen Institute. So you'll cherry pick, right, your content from the best in the world, right? So the second effect, I think, will be to relax the stranglehold that a lot of universities have on that. You should see the political infighting around what's in the required course, because what's in the required course means, oh, we have to staff that course. And so that's how you get more staffing for your department. That doesn't have anything to do with what do students actually need to learn, right? So things like that, I think, are going to start to be more disliked. I think, unfortunately, for a lot of them, a lot of these small liberal arts schools that have been running on very thin margins for a long time are going to have a very difficult time attracting students. And at the same time, you look at places like Southern New Hampshire University, which has been going down the online track for a really long time. I think schools like that are going to find an absolute uptick in their attractiveness because they've been at it long enough that they're getting really good at it. So do you want to do an online experience with Western Governors or SNHU who really understand how to make those experiences engaging, or do you want to go with kind of an amateur online experience from some entity that's just getting started? So I think a number of different things are going to have a huge impact on higher education.
Mm-hmm. Thinking back before Seeing Around Corners, you did some work around what you refer to as the new strategy playbook. Could you walk us through that framework for a moment?
Absolutely. So this was what I had in my previous book called The End of Competitive Advantage. And what I talk about is really a new way of thinking about strategy, which is really, we were at a different place. So let me put it in context. When I first started studying strategy, there were two dominant ideas. One was that industry mattered more than anything else. And the second one, which kind of followed on the first, was that what you wanted to do in strategy was find an attractive position in an attractive industry, throw up entry barriers like crazy, and repel outsiders and enjoy that competitive advantage for as long as you possibly could. So the whole notion of a sustainable competitive advantage. And since those days, what we've seen is the advent of far fewer barriers to entry. So we've had digitization, obviously. We've had globalization. We've had, the electrification, if you will, of things like movies, right? I mean, today, two kids in a garage with a reasonably priced smartphone can become Instagram stars. Without the control of a movie studio or any other intermediary, they can do that. I mean, 20 years ago, that was unthinkable. So what that led me to was a really different way of thinking about what do we want to do in strategy. And what I'm arguing that we want to do is to be continually looking for new advantages, even as our old advantages kind of peak and begin to erode. Now, here's the problem. When you look at traditional strategy, right, it was all about industries that existed. It was all about players that existed. It was all about a competitive space that existed. Traditional strategy had very little to say about, well, what's a new competitive space? How is a new industry going to be formed? How's a new innovation going to change things? So the way I think it needs to be done differently is the first issue you might call agility. I call it continuous reconfiguration, which isn't nearly as sexy. But this recognition that change is not the abnormal thing, that change is kind of getting to be the normal thing. And it's actually stability, which you need to be concerned about. Too stable for too long, you get very brittle. We've seen this now with our supply chains, right? You had so much emphasis on efficiency, very little emphasis on resilience. And so the new strategy playbook is going to need a lot more resilience. Then the second thing I think is healthy disengagement. And what I mean by that is when an advantage is exhausted, we need to be able to pull resources out of that to fund the next generation of advantages. So it becomes kind of a virtuous cycle. But what you find when you look at organizations, they cling on for a long, long, long time. So long past the time something's become relevant to a customer or necessary for the future, you still see it offered, right? And so I think we need to be much better about stopping things that really don't have much of a future.
Doesn't that play especially important today in terms of, in the midst of this crisis, there will be many businesses who are in a position where they will be forced to pivot because of many different factors, but consumers and suppliers and so forth. And so a means of healthy disengagement becomes an important part of every strategy discussion in organizations
Absolutely.
today.
And in fact, one of the things I talk about in a recent newsletter, and I'm doing a lot of presentations on this right now, is a 5-step process for sorting out your portfolio. So just briefly, the first one is do a mapping of your portfolio, because if you think about here's low uncertainty and here's high uncertainty, well, 6 months ago, a lot of stuff that was here is now here. And you need to be taking a different view of it. So second thing is revisit the strategy, right? And there's a lot of people telling me things like, well, strategy isn't relevant anymore. I would argue, no, it's more relevant than ever. Third is develop a set of screening statements that go together with your strategy. So they kind of turn your strategy into something that's very explicit. Fourth is then rank order all the things you're working on by how well they do as a result of the screens. Then start to make some decisions about what to disengage from. Then you can start looking for new opportunities. And that's when you can take the resources that you've freed up and said, well, maybe nobody wants, I'll give a specific example, nobody wants the shutters that we used to make, but I can make protective gear for physicians. I can pivot my business toward doing that. And then the last thing is to use a discovery-driven approach to planning those new businesses. So recognize you're not going to be able to plan. You can't be right. You're not going to be able to plan them as though you knew what you were doing because it's too uncertain. So take it step by step and plan each of the activities going forward.
When you think about where we're at today and the need to see around corners, to use your phrase, and to plan in an uncertain time, it doesn't really come down to identifying the perfect strategy once you know everything, especially today, right?
No.
What's the reality of how strategic planning should take place in organizations of every size, small, medium, and large, as they look at the potential realities that we'll see in the next normal?
Mhm. So I think Andy Grove put it very well. He said in the early stages of an inflection point, and I think we've all been living with this the last 5, 6 weeks, is just an intense amount of information gathering, right? So I just need to know what's going on out there. And Grove talked about a particular kind of person that you want in your conversation. He called them helpful Cassandras. And a Cassandra, as you know, is someone who tells the truth. And the problem with being a Cassandra is nobody believes you. And so, in this pandemic, we've had a number of helpful Cassandras. We've had Bill Gates, who was kind of ignored. We had the president's task force that was disbanded. We've had a lot of warnings from people who said, we're not prepared, we're not ready. So I think step one is you really want to gather as much information about what's going on as possible. And then step two is start to formulate some hypotheses about what you might believe to be true. So at Columbia, we're piloting the idea of maybe we take some of our in-person courses, executive education courses, and think about offering them in a different format. But we've got to figure out, do people want to, how do people want to consume them? I don't want to sit in front of a screen for 8 hours every day, right? How do we make it engaging? How do we build networks when everybody's not together? How do we incorporate the social aspect? So there's a lot we don't know. We have some hypotheses, but until we've tested those hypotheses with real potential customers, we're not going to know what exactly that is going to look like. My suspicion for that kind of offer is it will prompt us to build out another kind of offering. So there'll be our in-person experience, which will be one experience. And then there'll be a virtual experience, which may be completely different and at a different price point. We won't know yet for a while. So I think it's just setting out those hypotheses about what your future business could be that is the really important learning challenge.
How much of that have you seen in the consulting work that you do with companies all over the world at this point? I feel like a couple of weeks ago, so many companies were still hyper-focused on sort of that first horizon of protecting lives and livelihoods and financial resiliency. Have you seen people looking to emerge from crisis and plan for the next normal at this point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. For your listeners, Jim Kim has some fabulous, I believe they've been recorded, LinkedIn Live discussions. One with Stephanie Mehta of Fast Company, and I believe it's live on their site. The other is tomorrow at 11 o'clock. That's with Marshall Goldsmith, and that's a LinkedIn Live. So you just go to Marshall Goldsmith's LinkedIn page and it'll take you to that live stream. And he essentially talks about a 5-point plan. And he said every pandemic we've ever been successful at halting has these 5 points. So extensive testing, contact tracing, so we know who's been exposed, isolation of those who have been exposed, effective treatments for those who've gotten ill. And there may be one other one that I've left out, but he basically says if we do these 5 things, we can get in front of this. But if we don't do these 5 things, we're going to be dealing with flare-ups, for the foreseeable future. And that then has the second order effect of, well, okay, the restaurant's open. How comfortable are you going to be going there? When's the next time you want to be like this in a sports stadium? So it's just a lot of assumptions that we're making right now are based on kind of no data because we just don't know.
As we begin to form hypotheses and make assumptions and more data starts to make itself available to us, could you walk us through perhaps one of the most significant framework in the book around the 8 practices to see around corners?
Yeah, so I think, you've got kind of seeing the inflection point coming, deciding what to do about it, and then bringing the organization with you, each of which are pretty critical stages, right, of doing this. So the kinds of things I talk about when it's to see around corners. So the first one is really exposing yourself personally to what's changing. So in the case of the current crisis, I think, making sure that leaders are visible, making sure they're out there at the edges, making sure they're talking to their Cassandras, like who really has the information. And Stanley McChrystal, who wrote a wonderful book called Team of Teams, said, if I'm making decisions as the general in charge of this big operation in Afghanistan, that's probably a bad organizational design. Those decisions should be made by the people closest to the phenomenon. Second is really the importance of diversity. And I don't mean diversity in the politically correct sense. I mean, in a world of huge uncertainty, if I'm only got people who look at the world this way rather than sort of more broadly, my chances of missing something are much greater. So different education background, different organizational hierarchy, different location, empowering small teams. A lot of stuff can be done by small teams if they understand the context, if they understand the objectives, if they understand, what it is they're supposed to be doing. They can actually go and act fairly independently and much more responsively than if it had to go up and down some kind of hierarchy. Little bets, that's a phrase that was offered by Peter Sims, who wrote a great book of that same name. But the idea is you get resources right to the front line of the organization where you can do some experiments and tests. And an example of that would be Adobe's Kickbox. If you're not familiar with it, it's a red box, and inside are many things: some instructions, Post-it notes, of course, a notepad for bad ideas, and a gift card with $1,000 on it. And anybody at Adobe can get this $1,000 to try out an experiment. That's a beautiful example of a little bet. And it has lots of potential wondrous things that go with that, including training. So the ideas mostly don't go anywhere, but now you've got someone who knows something about innovation. They've taken a bet. They've tried something. Then this is the next one is a phrase that Steve Blank uses. He says, get out of the building. There are no answers to questions about customers or wisdom in the building. You got to get out. Candor. If people are not psychologically safe, if they're afraid of telling the truth, your chances of missing something really important go up dramatically. I mean, just dramatically. And Amy Edmondson did the original work on this. And what they found was errors in hospitals when nurses were afraid to speak up dramatically went up. When nurses were empowered to say, own the checklist, for example, medical errors went way down. So psychological safety, really, really important. Same with leadership. You want to encourage people to be as honest as you possibly can. And the phrase here that I love is Alan Mulally basically saying, you can't manage a secret, right? If everybody knows what the problems are and we work together to solve them, we can solve them, but you can't manage a secret. And then finally, this is something I borrowed from a science fiction writer, William Gibson. And he famously said, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And so the question is, how do you get yourself to where the future is beginning to make itself known? And a great example of this is, let's say it's important to your business to really understand how 20-year-olds are going to be behaving in 10 years. Well, guess what? They're all alive and well, and they're 10. So, that's a bit of the future that you can say with absolute certainty is going to be part of what the human, unless we, blow ourselves up or something, but the future 20-year-olds are already here, and they're all 10, right? So those practices can get you to where the phenomena are starting to make themselves felt.
Thanks for that. There's another really important concept in the book. If I own a small or medium-sized business and I want to sit down with my team, my leadership team to begin with, and start thinking about emerging stronger from this crisis and the various lenses we have to put on that plan with regards to customer engagement and supply chain engagement and employee engagement and well-being throughout the organization and our ecosystem partners and so forth. There's this concept of arenas, and it's not something that I learned about prior to reading Seen Around Corners. So I wonder if we could explore that for just a minute or two.
Sure. So an arena, as opposed to an industry, represents a space of some kind where you have resources, and you can think of yourself as contesting with other kinds of players to get people's jobs done, to get the jobs people want to get done in their lives. So let's take a concrete example, because I think it can be a little abstract. So let's think about teenagers, and let's think about the job teenagers want to get done in their lives with respect to clothing. So what does clothing mean to teenagers? Oh, a lot of it is, I want to be seen, I want to be noticed, I want to communicate something about myself, I belong to this tribe, I don't belong to that tribe. It's a very communicative kind of job. Now let's oppose on teenagers these things, right? Because every single one of them is like glued to the phones hermetically. So what are they doing on those phones? Starting in about 2003, 2004. Well, they're sending pictures of each other, right? So the job clothing is doing is now magnified by a digital impression. So I send a picture to my friend, I'm in a blue shirt. And 2 days later, I send another picture to another friend, and I'm in that same blue shirt. And comes the party on the weekend, I'm in that blue shirt. Do you not have anything else to wear? So the job, right, becomes how do I get clothing for the perfect selfie? And then it self-destructs. Now, I would argue that the whole phenomenon of fast fashion, which is an environmental scourge. It's very different than what my mother thought good clothing should be like. But I think it's really been driven for the last 15, 20 years by this desire on the part of teenagers to look different in Instagrammable or Facebookable pictures. And before we had Facebook, we had other sharing sites that people used. So the arena is sort of the disposable spending on apparel by families. But think about technology is actually pushing more traditional competitors almost out of being competitive in that arena. Now, who's benefiting? TJ Ross, TJ Maxx, Ross stores, H&M, Zara, all those fast fashion people, they've seen their businesses just expand. Who's on the outs? Well, even today, Penny's, Lord & Taylor, Macy's, definitely you can see that. And that trend was well underway before the current COVID crisis. So I think the arena idea is you identify what is the resource pool that you're contesting, what's the job to be done by the consumers or possible customers in that arena, and then you kind of work backward into, well, what does this mean for my business?
Great, thank you. We have a question that came in around innovation and the need for collaboration after the crisis. Is there a heavier emphasis today on collaboration between multiple stakeholders than there was maybe 90 days ago, or is that something that you've seen as part of the disruptive forces that existed before?
I think there has been in some sectors, driven partly by the crisis. So I think we are seeing unprecedented collaboration in pharmaceuticals, for instance. I mean, it is unheard of for all the pharmaceutical CEOs to be talking with each other, and they've got little task forces with members from different companies all working on, like, one group's working on a clinical trial, another group's working on a packaging thing, another group's working on a treatment. And so we've seen really unprecedented cooperation in that sector. I think in other sectors, there's been, one of the more interesting things is people who really didn't have a platform to collaborate are now finding that those are starting to spring up. So we're seeing freelancers, for example, banding together under various collaboration platforms. We're seeing things like Uber drivers and Instacart pickers now actually creating almost a collective consciousness that they share this common experience. So I do think there's more collaboration along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. We touched on higher ed before, and we have a question from Christine Farr, who's from Mount Mary University here in Wisconsin. And she asks, given that you come from higher ed, how do you think that accreditation and credentials that are required in professions, medical industry, IT, engineering, and so on, will impact hiring and the education of professionals?
Ooh, I think that's a multi-layered thing. So on the side of the angels, you do want accreditation that's fairly strict for professions where, there's a lot at risk. I mean, I don't want unqualified engineers designing bridges. I don't want unqualified medical people, treating patients. So I think there's an enormous need for accreditation that's considered legitimate. Now, on the side of the devils, an awful lot of accreditation is being driven by narrow parochial interests. So when you start seeing required accreditations for hair salonists and people that, I don't know, take your groceries around or whatever, that's really just creating a barrier to entry for the existing incumbents. And that's where I think accreditation gets a little difficult. Now for higher ed, more specifically, a lot of the business model is driven around some kind of credential. So you have to get so many units to get this kind of credential. And that's kind of kept the system in place. Once you can measure the scalability of somebody without the credential, then it becomes it's harder for higher ed to survive through that transition, is what I would say.
Thank you. A question from Mike Hennick in Milwaukee. Do you see a greater collaborative relationship between higher ed and industry as a necessity or a necessary result of the inflection point that we're in right now? And if you do, what should that changed relationship look like?
Sure. I'll give a couple of examples of some programs that I think are really creative and get it right. So IBM years ago partnered with industry and higher ed to create a program they called PTech, which is, what does it stand for? Prepare for Technology or something like that. But what it is it's a 6-year program, which is 4 years of high school plus 2 years of an associate degree. And if you get through PTech, the member companies of the coalition that's behind it now basically guarantee you a job. Because they have faith in the skills being taught. They know the program is rigorous. They know it's been designed with their needs in mind. And so one of the things that they realized was they've got a dramatic shortage of skilled workers in technology. That's a huge gap, and it exists even today. And they looked at what are the barriers to people, particularly people from less advantaged communities, getting into technology. And what they realized was, a lot of these students would never have thought about a 4-year school, or couldn't afford a 4-year school, or couldn't afford that kind of experience. But if you built it right into the high school curriculum, and everybody was able to see you through, you graduate with your high school degree and an associate's degree. And an interesting byproduct of that is a lot of the PTech students who have been successful at PTech are now going on to get 4-year degrees to get an even better sort of position in their companies. So that's, to me, a really interesting example of a business, academia, sort of local partnership.
It's a flagship program that's had tremendous results. We have a question from small business sector as it relates to scenario planning, the things that we've already talked about. How would you recommend approaching alignment throughout the organization and prioritization to put a right-sized execution plan in place? Are there some steps there that you've got some thoughts about?
Yeah, well, this is really what I was talking about before, which is you need to really look at your portfolio. You need to be crystal clear on your strategic priorities, right? And over time, these things get muddy. People lose focus. Then you need to make some hard decisions about what I call it, you scorecarding them, right? So you get them on a common playing field, decide what you can resource and what you can't. And then what you need to look at is, where are there new opportunities coming out that we might want to explore? A lot of the right size element comes down to how well you're managing your portfolio of investments, how you're dealing with the resource allocation process.
Rita, there was a question that came in around incumbent mentality. So how would you go about convincing leadership that innovation, especially at a time like this, is so necessary for businesses not only to survive, but to thrive in the future? So how has that conversation changed, and what are some things people can do to take the incumbent mindset out of the organization?
Right. So one of the things I talk about in the new strategy playbook piece is innovation as an actual proficiency. And where we are with a lot of companies right now is what I would call innovation theater. So let's get everybody in a plane and we'll go to Silicon Valley and, we'll ride around on the Google bikes or whatever. But then we come back to home base and everything's the same as it was when we left. So to build an actual proficiency, you need 3 things. You need the ability to capture ideas. That's, of course, important. But that's not usually the biggest barrier. Most organizations are absolutely ingenious. They have more ideas than you could do anything with. The second thing is a difficult problem, which is the incubation process. So going from an idea to something where you can create product market fit, customer fit. And then if you're actually going to have a meaningful contribution to the firm, you need to be able to ramp it up. We call that acceleration. All right, so let's say you're a senior executive, don't care about innovation. All I want to do is, produce ROI, whatever. We have actually got a metric that was developed by my colleague, Alex Van Putten, and it's called the Imagination Premium. And I'll spare you the mechanics, but basically you can take a firm's market cap if they're publicly traded and break it into the implied value of growth as opposed to the implied value of operations. And if you divide the two, you get a ratio. So an Amazon, right, something like 2 to 3/4 of its entire market cap is all expectations for growth. because it plows everything back into the business. So it doesn't generate a lot of free cash flow. Versus a General Electric, their imagination premium was 0.49. And at that point, you are takeover bait, you're going to attract an activist, you're going to be at the wrong end of this. So what we do, right, is we show people that their numbers relative to their peers and relative to others. And it's been a fairly robust metric that I think could be a counterweight to a lot of these more narrow, backward looking measures that so many people look at. So in effect, it takes Nadella's idea, right, of let's look at leading indicators and translates it into a solvable metric that you can use using publicly available data.
That's a tremendous metric. I would love to spend some more time on that. I've got a last question from Keith Ruttman. Keith asks, in the context of the 8 practices to see around corners, he mentions that most of them seem to be human qualities. What's the role of technology, data science, taking some of the guesswork out, signal versus noise, ML, and so forth, to see around corners?
Sure. So I believe it's tremendous. It has tremendous potential. But they're tools, right? And any tool can be used well or it can be used badly. The important thing to remember about a lot of these big data kind of metrics is sort of 3 things. So the first one is the challenge is not the technology. The challenge is knowing what you're trying to answer for in the technology. So what problem are you trying to solve? And until you really are clear on what question you're trying to ask, the data aren't going to help you. So I have a colleague who says, look, design the data table you'd like to have after the analysis, before the analysis is done, and then you'll know how to drive the data. So the first thing is know what question you want to ask. Second thing is big data are only as useful as the data set is representative of the population you're trying to understand. So if you've got a big data set and it's got all white men in it, you should not be extrapolating anything you learned from that data set to an African American community, a mixed race community, a bunch of women. It just doesn't work. And there's a fabulous book out. It's called Invisible Women, which talks about how women are literally dying because people use data taken from men and just extrapolate it onto services and products designed for women. And the last thing I would say is an awful lot of the data that you're going to be looking at is what I call lagging indicators. It's great data, but it's about stuff that won't, that you can't do anything about. So be very careful about making forward-looking decisions on the basis of lagging indicators.
Rita, I can't thank you enough for taking the time, especially I know how extremely busy you are right now, and appreciate so much your expertise and perspective and the impact it can have on businesses as we look to emerge from the crisis and find ways to really thrive in business and in life in the next normal. So thank you so much for taking the time, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you.